Welcome. I'm Dr. Allison Dobrik. My pronouns are she, her. I serve as Associate Professor in the William Patterson University College of Education, as well as the Director of the University Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Before we begin, I want to take the time to thank the BL Manger Foundation for sponsoring this event and for their generous support throughout the entire year. This vital support has greatly enhanced our ability to engage students, faculty, local teachers, and community members in a wide variety of ways around anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and related topics. Renee Manger of the BL Manger Foundation is here with us today, so I'm so glad to have the opportunity to thank her alongside some of the many people currently participating in programs sponsored by the foundation, such as the 6 local high school history and English teachers who are right now engaged in our workshop series on anti-Semitism and racism, and the 2 William Patterson University student interns who are helping us to expand the center's work. Thank you so much. Okay. So on to today's program, which, like I said, will be an interactive one. So if you would like to speak, please raise your hand and or feel free to type questions into the chat. Our audience members today bring a wide range of expertise and experiences to this critical conversation. So if you don't mind, please share a little bit about yourself as you contribute. Our presenter and facilitator today is Dr. Koach Baruch Fraser, audiologist, musician, and Reconstructionist rabbinical intern. He is a co-convener of the Tzedek Lab, a national multiracial network of trainers, organizers, spiritual leaders, and cultural workers, Jews, and allies that seeks to inspire collective action against racism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. Koach, thank you for virtually visiting William Patterson and leading us in conversation today on a critical topic that affects us all, how racism and anti-Semitism fuel racial capitalism. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here with you all. My name is Koach Baruch Fraser. I use they and he pronouns. And as a point of access, I'm a chocolate brown, trans-masculine human. I have payas and black rim glasses. I have on a gray and white striped shirt today. I have some beautiful art in the back of me. Now, if you've signed up for how racism and anti-Semitism fuel racial capitalism, you're in the right place. Today, we have the opportunity to do 2 things. Well, at least these 2 things. To learn how anti-Semitism and racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, work to keep racial capitalism going. And we get to know who our friends are and who our enemies are, meaning you know what your stake is in racial capitalism. So I want to begin here with a land acknowledgement, which is how I start all of the sessions that I facilitate. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see here. There we go. All right. So one part of being in community is taking a cue from our indigenous siblings here on Turtle Island by opening up our space with reverence and respect for this land that we live on and the people who steward it. As Jews, and I'm assuming a lot of us are Jews, but if some of you are not, as human beings living here, but as Jews, we have an ancient and complex relationship to land, indigeneity, and diaspora. Our tradition therefore compels us to acknowledge all indigenous peoples who have been and continue to live and exist in relationship to the lands where we currently dwell. We also must remind ourselves, lest we forget, that colonization is an ongoing process, with native lands still occupied due to the deceptive and broken treaties. So we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape peoples who steward what has become known as Wayne, New Jersey. Now, acknowledgement by itself is but a small gesture, but it only becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. And I pray that that's what we are doing individually and collectively as a community. Now, before we start today, I would like for us to bring to mind those who we are bringing into this space, or those we want to dedicate our learning to as we enter this conversation about racial capitalism. So I want to give us a few seconds to do that. You can do that in the chat. I think that would probably be the most efficient way. But if you are wanting to dedicate your learning today to someone, to a group of people, or a particular place, please put that in the chat now. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you all in the case that I can read the chat. I'm dedicating my learning today to my grandma. Her name is Andela Peterson, Zikronala Verka, who has taught me so much about what it means to be accountable compassionately to ourselves and each other. All right. So, before I do that, let me go back here. All right. If we are to move forward together, it is important for us to be rooted in definitions, to have shared language as we navigate the complexity and the nuance in our lives and in our work. So today we'll be moving through several definitions: racial capitalism, racism, whiteness, anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, intersectionality, and power. So let's start with racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is a term that was coined by Cedric J. Robinson. And he says that racial capitalism is an economic system dependent on racial myths, violence, imperialism, and genocide. And that was it. It was exported across the globe from Europe. In short, racial capitalism is the means by which the modern empire is built and sustained. Our racial identities have been assigned value, and they are then commodified for the benefit of those in power. This economic system relies on us buying into the racial myths and the values that were assigned to them. Now, sometimes that buy-in is explicit, and other times it is implicit. The implicit nature of our buy-in can sometimes be linked to all of us growing up in a world where the myths are taught to us as truth through books, TV, our families, and our schools. And we're going to look at two very specific racial myths that work well together: anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. But we'll start with the basics. What's racism? I'll invite anyone to come off of mute if they want to read this slide.
I'll do it.
All right.
The whole thing?
Just start with racism is different.
Okay. Racism is different from racial prejudice, hatred, or discrimination. Racism involves one group having the power to carry out systematic discrimination through the institutional policies and practices of the society, and by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices.
Thank you. Now, when we talk about racism, we have to be clear that it takes many forms and manifestations. What is also clear is that at the heart of it is whiteness, which stands in direct opposition to Blackness. Now, the term white, referring to people, was created by Virginia slave owners and colonial rulers in the 17th century. It replaced terms like Christian and Englishman to distinguish European colonists from Africans and indigenous peoples. European colonial powers established whiteness as a legal concept after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, during which indentured servants of European and African descent had united against the colonial elite. We see how racial capitalism is forming here. The legal distinction of white separated the servant class on the basis of skin color and continental origin. The creation of whiteness meant giving privileges to some while denying them to others with the justification of biological and social inferiority. In fact, Robin DiAngelo notes in her book White Fragility that whiteness is dynamic, relational, and operating at all times on myriad of levels. These processes and practices include basic rights, values, beliefs, perspectives, and experiences, purported to be commonly shared by all, but which are actually only consistently afforded to white people. But on the other hand, anti-Blackness describes the inability to recognize Black humanity. It captures the reality that the kind of violence that saturates Black life is not based on anything specific, on any specific thing a Black person, better described as a person who has been racialized Black, did. You see, the violence we experience isn't tied to any particular transgression. It's gratuitous and unrelenting. Anti-Blackness covers the fact that society's hatred of Blackness and also its gratuitous violence against Black people is complicated by its need for our existence. Black people are at once despised and also a useful counterpoint for others to measure their humanness against. In other words, while one may experience numerous compounding disadvantages, at least they're not Black. We're going to take a moment to pause here. I want us to reflect on these notions of anti-Blackness and whiteness and racial capitalism. And so I'll ask you to take a moment to either reflect by writing or by holding this in your mind. How do I hold anti-Blackness or whiteness inside of me? As a person who grew up in a fundamentally white supremacy power structure, how am I holding that? Either in my body, in my mind, and how I operate, how I see things operating in my world. How are you holding that? It's going to take a few minutes to do that. If you feel so moved and you want to put it in the chat, feel free to do so. That's not a requirement. All right, give you a few more seconds here to reflect on that. All right. So let's dive into the other racial myth, anti-Semitism. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice say that originating in European Christianity, anti-Semitism is the form of ideological oppression that targets Jews. In Europe and in the United States, it has functioned to protect the prevailing economic system and the almost exclusively Christian ruling class by diverting blame for hardship onto Jews. Like all oppressions, it has deep historical roots and uses exploitation, marginalization, discrimination, and violence as its tools. Like all oppressions, the ideology contains elements of dehumanization and degradation via lies and stereotypes about Jews, as well as a mythology. The myth changes and adapts to different times and places, but fundamentally it says that Jews are to blame for society's problems. It's important to note that anti-Semitism does not account for the totality of Jewish oppression, and it was through Christian Europe colonization that it made its way across the world. So I want to take one other moment to reflect now on anti-Semitism. How might you be holding anti-Semitism inside as a person who grew up in a fundamentally white supremacy power structure? How do I hold anti-Semitism inside me as a person who grew up in a fundamentally white supremacy power structure? Feel free to keep putting things in the chat if you so desire. We live in a world where these myths are multiplying and amplifying each other in service of uplifting and maintaining empire. And when we are paying attention, we can see this in action. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And here's where I hope that we can get into a little bit of a conversation. How have we seen anti-Blackness, as we understand it through what we were talking about earlier, and anti-Semitism working together? How have we seen anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism working together to uplift and maintain empire? So feel free to come off mute if you would like to. I'd love to hear voices in the space, but also you can use the chat. How have we seen anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism working together?
I'm going to throw this in. They're both used by white supremacists very intensively, very interchangeably, very destructively. And it depends which is more hated at a given moment.
Mm-hmm.
Which group is more hated?
Thanks for throwing that in there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the othering of different groups definitely works here. I mean, I just put something in the chat about that, but I have often felt quite other in America. I mean, if you think about from mid-November through early January, you know, I don't feel like I necessarily belong here in America. And to me, that's tied in somewhat to that whiteness. I never really felt like I was in that white group because I was always being othered in that way.
Thank you for that. Other ways in which we've noticed anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism working together.
One way that I've always found particularly difficult is the way anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism are used to work against each other. My grandparents grew up in starvation. My father is a Holocaust survivor, and yet we came in the 20s and 1940s, and to a great extent they became white, and they assumed the mantle and the privileges of this white superiority, and at the same time did not escape from those other burdens. And so it's a complex and multifaceted conflict.
Thank you, Yuri. We're going to talk a little later about intersectionality, and I think it will speak directly to what you're talking about. I saw some folks mentioning Charlottesville and the folks with the tiki torches saying Jews will not replace us. And I've been very clear that they weren't talking about me. there is a very distinct connection they were making with this expansion and this compressing of whiteness, right? And in the moment of much distress, this happens all the time when we look at how the economic system is so tied to racism and anti-Semitism, is that when things get tight and people feel constriction on their economic pathway to their presumed pathway to wealth, they will start to compress whiteness. And so the people who could be white before, which has included many people of color, starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so yes, when they were chanting "Jews will not replace us," and you have to remember, like, this was a rally that was like in direct response to Black folks saying you you got to stop your racist policies and practices in this country. And this is continuous how they bring these two together. I want to lift up two more examples, and then if you all have others, please keep doing it. I was a participant in the Ferguson uprising back in 2014, and what I remember is that folks would say either in social media, and we'd also hear it on these news reports, that George Soros was somehow paying the protesters, which is interesting for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that for those whom that dog whistle was heard, they could not imagine that Black folks had humanity and or dignity and could stand up and fight against the system that was killing them. So they said, well, somebody has to be helping them out. And what do we know about anti-Semitism? This trope of like, well, the Jews are going to get in the between the power structure and those who are up under it, and they're going to create some kind of problem where that they either they're amplifying the protest, they're amplifying the people who are fighting back against the system. Yes, it's divide and conquer, right? And so people went with that, and they were like, oh, so apparently Jewish folks are helping these protesters in Ferguson. I will have to say that as a Black Jewish person who was there out on the streets, I never got a check. And also, I fought vehemently against this notion, because even some folks, people of color, were starting to they were starting to believe this. And this is again how it works. Racial capitalism depends on us believing these myths, right? One more example I want to lift up. Just in 2018, when we had the hysteria, the hysteria continues over immigration in our country. And we had the group HIAS, right, the Jewish Immigration Relief Organization, who was working, around the clock as they always do to help immigrants come into the country. And they had put on a teach-in at Tree of Life Synagogue, right? And then what did we see? We saw that folks looked at that and they said, well, it must be that Jewish folks are the reason why we have all these immigrants coming into the country. And they went and they killed our people in the synagogue. It wasn't just because they were Jewish, it was because it was being tied to this notion of immigrants who are overwhelmingly Black and brown were coming into this country, and they were somehow disrupting the economic system as they knew it. Somehow that was going to, again, disturb their pathway to economic success. And so we see this over and over again. These are two recent examples that I could think of. And you all have brought up a few others. I don't know whether or not you're sitting on other examples. You're like, I want to share this one because I want us to hear just how many ways this manifests. And when we aren't paying attention, we miss it. But when we are paying attention, we see those connections. So I'll hush for a few more minutes and see what else you might have to say. All right. So the question is, how do we fight back against this? How do we, one, get ourselves noticing what's happening, which I think that you all are already kind of combing through and figuring that out, seeing those connections. But then how do we fight back against the system? Here we go. Oh, I think I missed something. Oh, Sammy Davis Jr. Ah, yes. You want to say more about that?
Sure, I put that in there. It's just something I remember growing up, and I didn't have the words to sort of understand what was happening. But I just noticed that Sammy Davis Jr., while ostensibly a member of that group, was treated very differently, and in what today would appear to be very racist, harsh terms. And again, as a kid, I didn't know what to make of that. I just knew that he was being othered, to use modern terms.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this othering will, we see it popping up. I think Wendy and Yuri and, oh, I lost track of who else spoke. I'm so sorry. I'm losing names here. But all of you who have spoken already have told us about this othering. And part of that is as the project of becoming an American in the system of racial capitalism does that, like this need to other folks, kind of making a distinction between other peoples, keeps us at that divide and conquer place. And that's where we don't want to be. All right. And so one way I feel that we can fight back is through an understanding of intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is an understanding about life that comes from a long line of Black women. And in the tradition of Bashim Umro, we will mention their names. In the name of Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Claudia Jones, Frances Bill, and Angela Davis, and the women of the Combahee River Collective, and Kimberly Crenshaw, we speak this truth to power. In her book, The Purpose of Power, Alicia Garza says this: intersectionality is a way to understand how power operates. Diversity is what happens when you have representation of various groups in a place. Representation is what happens when the groups that haven't previously been included are included. Intersectionality is a framework by which we examine how groups that experience multiple points of discrimination get their needs met at the same time, not in spite of other groups in the same situation. And this is where the point gets highlighted for me. Intersectionality asks us to examine the places where we are marginalized, but it also demands that we examine how and why those of us who are marginalized can in turn exercise marginalization over others. How is it that we get so wrapped up in these distinctions of racial capitalism that has valued these distinctions among us, that we then in turn marginalize other people? So let's talk about power. Power is the ability to impact and affect the conditions of your own life and the lives of others, and could be thought about in a myriad of ways, one of which is power over, another is power with, and another is power within. But what we're most familiar with is this notion of power where there is a little person or a person at the top, and then more and more people are at the bottom. They have less and less power. They have less and less ability to change their situation in their life. I brought this slide because as Jewish folks, I love to talk about Pharaoh and how that power structure was actually something that is resonant for a lot of people. And so we see from the bottom that there are slaves, and then as we go up, we have scribes and soldiers, and then we have Pharaoh. And this is our typical understanding of power. But my friend and colleague, my brother um, Langston Hagens, what he says is that actually within racial capitalism, power is turned up on this kind of power structure is actually on its head. That this is we actually have power as an upside down triangle. And so I'm going to show you. I drew it. This is what we are currently working with as our understanding of power. That racial capitalism, with its myths that we are buying into, are held up by these structures. They're held up by anti-Black racism, by anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, poverty, queer and transphobia, the carceral system, you name it, we could put it on here. And that actually, without these myths and without our buy-in to them, racial capitalism couldn't exist and it couldn't stand. And so if it feels right, it's actually kind of cool to embody what this looks like. So we have a triangle with you make a triangle with your hand, and you can see that these things are what hold up this power. And if these didn't exist, then the structure would fall. That we actually have the power within ourselves to make power with those who are also stuck up under this system of racial capitalism, to remove the structures that keep it going. And that when we build power with each other and dismantle these pillars, these racial myths, that racial capitalism actually has nothing else to hold it up. So once we get clear about how it is these structures are maintained through these myths that we're believing in, that we buy into, and the fact that we have the power to dismantle them, I believe that we can rid ourselves of racial capitalism, that we actually can stop fueling it, and we can remove its power because we actually have the power to remove it. So I think I'm running early. So would love to hear your comments, questions, concerns about this. I'm going to stop my share because I'd love to hear more about what you all are thinking, what you have to say about this.
I'll go since
All
no one
right.
else is, but I hope I'll set a trend, you know. I have heard whiteness for Jewish Americans described as conditional whiteness. And this kind of ties into what you were saying about the compressing of that definition and the changing of that definition. But like, is that a useful construct, do you think? Or is it, I guess I'm struggling to kind of understand where all those things overlap, you know? I mean, on some level, if you're appearing white, you have to own that and that's part of your experience and identity. On the other hand, many of us have faced anti-Semitism and our ancestors faced way worse, you know, so different times and different applications.
Mm-hmm.
You think that's a useful construct, I guess, is my question.
For some people, it may be useful. It may be useful to understand what's happening. I think that intersectionality answers a lot of those questions, because intersectionality is the like understanding the totality of one's being and how you can be oppressed based on the totality of your being. So it's not just that maybe you have skin that is white or white passing. It's the fact that you are Jewish. It's the fact that you're a woman, right? Like all of that affects the impact of oppression from this system upon you. And so I think that, you know, oftentimes intersectionality gets used as like against people. And I think that when we understand at its core, it's talking about power and how power manifests and how it manifests differently based off of the totality of who we are, not just I'm Jewish or I'm white passing or I'm Black or I'm trans. It's all of me. Like there's nothing, the impact of oppression on me as a Black trans Jewish person is much different from other people, but it doesn't mean that you or anybody else in this room isn't experiencing oppression based off of whatever identities they are holding. And this is like your ability or disability, like all of that's included in the impact of oppression. And whatever will work well for the people you are with, if they can hear and understand that notion of conditional whiteness, that's perfect. Because the point is that people get it, and the people are understanding, one, how whiteness works, that it is always conditional no matter who they assign it or give it to, and how whiteness is actually interfacing with the other parts of racial capitalism.
I didn't want to jump ahead of others, but I guess everyone who knows me here will know that I don't hold back. I was thinking a lot about my daughter who went to she's an African American girl who went to a Chinese elementary school, and so from grade 2 through 6 she was in a 98% Chinese school, and it made me think a lot about things like democracy. We think of democracy as almost as eternal as capitalism, but neither is eternal, and both are fragile and both are transient. And so being embedded in Chinese culture, something like democracy has no real deep value and no deep historical resonance. And neither does whiteness. And yet the superior majority culture is overwhelmingly powerful, that concept. And so, just sort of think a lot about these ideas in an international context. And I'm just sort of wondering about your thoughts about, like, there will be a day when, yes, whiteness has not only contracted, but maybe even morphed into something new, and yet oppression will probably still exist.
Absolutely. I think about, like, just in terms of like how whiteness arrived, right? You think about how the like it, part of the description that I use for whiteness talks about this notion of it replacing one's idea of what a Christian was, right? And to have that notion of Christian was already a delineation between non-Christians and Christians, which happened to be Jews and Muslims, right, and all the other folks who were not Christian. And that was a part of an economic system that needed to maintain itself and wanted to distribute wealth to other Christians, right? And then they decided that, like as people, do, they start to realize that these distinctions that are being made by the power structure don't actually work for us. That we understand that we're not so far apart, and we're being pitted against each other. And so then they created a new marker, which was whiteness, right? And yes, we'll probably see this evolve until somebody else decides they want to be on top and they get the power and the money to do it. And so yes, it might have a different name, it might manifest itself slightly differently, but like you said, oppression, because I think of just how we are conditioned around power, I don't know whether or not we'll be able to move away from being this oppression to leave us. I want it to. I really do. And I think that I keep leaning into this notion of intersectionality and understanding that we are not just one, we're made up of one thing. And I think the more we understand that about ourselves and each other, then it gets harder for people to pin us against each other.
There are some people in the chat that are asking about what kind of action steps we can do to kick out some of those pillars in your drawing. And someone had mentioned, for example, voter suppression that's working against the majority of us building a more anti-racist, diverse society.
I'm on that train with y'all. We have to be. I've actually really been into Alicia Garza's book, The Purpose of Power, and it's really just a great almost manual for people who are organizers. I don't know if there's any organizers here in this space, but I think teachers are like some good organizers too. So, but when you think about like our ability to not to change somebody's heart or mind, but to really like be in deep relationship with other people, we have to be doing not just thinking about like the bigger, like we got to hopefully more people will vote and change who is in power so that we have a little more ease in our ability to move about in this world, but to have real and meaningful relationships with other people give us a step up so that we can do that work of finding out the totality of the rest of the people in our community instead of just focusing on what we might see or what we hear from other people about folks. That's part of the work.
I
Okay,
think,
I'm gonna
can
go ahead.
I hop in
Yes,
there?
please.
Hi. I think a lot of it, I'm a teacher, so I think a lot of it does start with, education, exposure. You know, we if you can't expose kids to other kinds of cultures by going on either field trips or having a diverse classroom, we really have to focus the literature, the history, the examples that we use, so that it becomes more natural to talk about every background and everybody's experience, with their own personal cultural identity, racial identity. But I think the flip side too, there's so much, I feel like there's so much talk about, teaching not to hate, which is fantastic. But I think too, for me personally, a lot of times I have to stop and look at myself and say, when I have a resentment or when I have a negative feeling, what's causing that? I need to recognize in myself, am I afraid that I'm going to lose my position of power, whether it's in my own home with my teenage kids, if it's in the classroom with my students, if it's outside of that, I mean, as a lowly high school teacher, I really don't have all that much power in the world. But I really do try to spend a lot of time like, whoa, stop for a second. Why am I feeling like this anger or resentment? And if I can identify in myself what's triggering it, then I can work on fixing that from inside, and then sharing that with others. And I don't know, I guess we have to all become really a lot more introspective as well, because until we can identify in each of us why this, we feel that way, then groups will continue to perpetuate this negative behavior as well, until we can identify what's at the root of it and how can I fix what's at the root of it. Thanks.
Hallelujah. uh, if I didn't know better, I'd say that that you were a plant in here to for us to talk about moving through our feelings and emotions and like how that works. I took that out, and I'm so happy you talked about it because I'm going to share my screen one more time. Um, there's someone who I get a lot of Torah from, and that is Resma Menachem, and he wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands, and he talks so brilliantly about this. And what he says is that healing involves discomfort, but so does refusing to heal. And over time, refusing to heal is always more painful. And that he actually has the system that he works folks through um, called moving through clean pain, because he says dirty pain is like that impulsive response that we give to a lot of things that feel uncomfortable or maybe don't feel like they're aligned with our values if we go there. But he says moving through clean pain allows us to like be with the feeling, be with the emotion, but allow it to move. Like don't allow it to get stuck. And so I'll real quickly go through this, but I'm just resonating so much with what you said. So he has 5 anchors of moving through clean pain. And the first is like whenever that conflict or that uncomfortability or whatever is happening in you comes, he says to soothe yourself, quiet your mind, And actually, he said this is the part where we don't say anything, because oftentimes we're responding from that impulse as opposed to a settled body. He says to notice the sensations, the vibrations that are happening in your body, accepting the discomfort, but noticing when it changes. Staying present in your body as you move through this unfolding, uncertain situation. He says that even if you try to figure out what's going to happen next, you can't. And the last part is to discharge the energy. A lot of times when we get into the heat of like this discomfort and not understanding what's going on, we don't allow it to get out of us. And so I'll tell you a quick story. Hopefully I have time for this. Just the other day, I was doing a presentation similar to this, but not the same, with another Black Jewish person. We were doing it with with a Jewish community here in America, and right before we went on, they told us that we had to take out some slides. This was like 5 minutes before, and it created a bit of a conflict, to say the least. But what I'll tell you is that after it was done, I took a walk around my block. I allowed myself to like do some kind of physical activity, because otherwise I would have allowed that to just build up and build up and build up. And I like, even talking about it right now doesn't have that angst that I had a week ago, because I've been doing my work of like allowing, like being with the discomfort, sitting through it, but also moving, allowing it to give me a response of like, well, what was that about? What was my where was what was mine to hold in that conflict? Maybe what was theirs to hold, and to like think about that, so that I'm not trying to hold everything. I can't. And to move my body, to do some kind of physical activity after that conflict or that discomfort is there, so that I can then like be more present to what's happening around me. So thank you again for bringing that up, Amy. What else is coming up for you all? Questions, concerns, comments?
It's interesting that you talk about interpersonal relationships. Just it's something that I've always thought about, that the more we can know people one-on-one on an individual level, the more we're going to understand who they are and what their needs are, and they're going to understand us. And I've brought that up in other programs I've attended and been chastised a bit to be in the arena of, well, it's not somebody else's job to tell you about their background. And that's absolutely correct. And that's not what I recommend. I don't recommend tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, hey, I'm Jewish, you're Black, I think we have things in common. That's not what I'm talking about. But truly focusing, like Amy, to your point, keeping my eyes open for people who appear different than I am and yet might have similarities, and striking up a relationship, and not starting off with that discussion of, gee, you know, what do we have in common, but seeing if you have a connection. That's a micro level, but I feel like at the same time, you know, the micro relationships can, of course, in the long run, make a big difference.
Absolutely. And I think about, and I'll let you jump in here, Elizabeth, but I think about Chevruta, and how we have the spiritual technology of studying together and being with another person, right? Trying to learn new things and like mull over and wrestle with a text or with our tradition. And at the root of the root of Chevruta is chaver, which is friend, right? So like the point of us doing it is to build that relationship. So right, I use this as a way of telling people, you know, when we are struggling together, like we're in that like that infamous struggle, like Yaakov, I will like Yisrael. We're doing it so that we can actually build that muscle for disagreement. Like that disagreement doesn't break our ability to be in relationship with somebody. we build that muscle for like really trying to get deeper into things without staying surface level, right? That we have a tradition of being in relationship with each other in that way. And I think that it serves us well when we use that kind of model of, really trying our best to study and learn together for the um, for the reason of being in relationship, deepening our relationship. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Where you wanted to say something?
Yeah, hi. Sorry. It's just when you said like how we want to, like, oppression may always be there. It'll just be somebody else being the oppressor really kind of hit me when we were talking about that. And it made me think of, like, people in power just always want to keep their power. You can see it in every society. It made me think of, like, all societies have a power group. And when you show up that pyramid, I'm like, gosh, it really should be the other way around. The power should be with the people, with the many, not with the few. And it's just mind boggling. And it made me think of a great Charles Blow article I read, The Lowest White Man, how the lowest white man will always identify with people who are nowhere near his class, nowhere near his socioeconomic standing, but because he would rather do that, like you said, than have his whiteness be conflated with an African American, I'm saying, with blackness. And that was part of that divide and conquer that I've been seeing pop up. And it just kind of struck, like, how do you fix this? Like, is this just going to be a perpetual problem that, like, I hope, like, is there just going to be some group that's always got, like, I just picture when you said to step up, I just picture someone at the top of the mountain, and I think everyone wants to just be up there. We're not trying to kick anybody off. We just want our place. Everyone wants a place, but other people up there just keep stepping on the fingers that are reaching over to get a hand up, and they just keep stepping on them, saying, no, 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 you can't. And I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but yeah, just all these things keep swimming in my mind, like, and I try to have conversations with I don't know, people that, and sometimes it's frustrating because you're like, are you hearing anything that I'm saying? Like those, I hate to say ultra concerned, like the real, the people really far, and I'm like, I feel like I don't know how to bridge it. Like, I don't know how to get a dialogue with them because they just seem, I hear what they're saying, but now can you hear, like, I don't know. It just, like said, yeah, communication, all vital. And the awkward silence you have when you had us asking about that whiteness and how we deal with who we are. We don't know. I was just always a white person, you know what I mean? But I could tell stories of my Irish grandmother who said she was no fan of Winston Churchill. They were totally degraded by the British, you know what I'm saying? Like, and there's an all-white society, and that's kind of crazy, you know what I'm saying? So I guess everyone, I always say this, every culture has its tears, it has its joys, and I don't know why we aren't more together. Like, we have so much more in common. I believe we have so much more to pull us together, and yet we are constantly divided. And so there's so many things are coming at me with everyone saying, I'm reading and it's just like, wow, like you know what, we're not going to fix this in an hour.
Well, that was my plan, and we still have 6 more minutes. I have faith in us. I have faith in us. Yeah, I thank God for all that folks are trying to do to bridge gaps, and just know that, like, not everybody is going to hear you. As an audiologist, I learned a lot about the difference between listening and hearing. And listening takes intention, and it takes the ability of one to not just hear words and try to put them together, but to actually intend to understand what the other person is trying to say. And not everybody's there. Not everybody is at that point. And so there's this thing that they say conserve your energy, or like, protect your energy. There are people, some people will hear other people and they won't hear you, or they'll listen to somebody else and they won't listen to you. And just know that maybe that's not the person that you're going to be chavruta with, and that's okay. There's many people to be chavruta with, and so, like, to hopefully take some of that pressure off and not feel the need to, like, want to engage with everybody who is kind of at the point in which the struggling is too hard. But know that hopefully there are other people who will be able to engage with them, and maybe they'll be the one that they can wrestle with these ideas and these understandings of our world, and things will change with them. I think you're doing fine though. Don't feel too much pressure to be at them.
I wanted to mention, just couldn't go by any conversation like this without mentioning probably my most favorite intersectional person, which would be James Baldwin. And one thing that he comes back to again and again is not just the damage that the oppressed receives, or that the system, the racial capitalist system, inflicts on the weaker party, but that the damage it does to the entire society, and that the oppressor becomes frozen and loses their soul and loses their ability to examine themselves. And he had so much love that he kept on coming back to that over and over again.
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways in which that last part of the what Alicia Garza talks about intersectionality asks us to do is to find out how we can not be a part of that oppressive system, because it's easy to get caught up in it, and oftentimes implicitly we are caught up in it just because we live where we live. We have we have access to what we have access to. Some of us have access to more than others, but it wasn't because of anything we did. It was because that's how we were born and where we were born. And so we have to interrogate that. And that's some of that, that interrogation and that struggle that I think Amy was talking about too. We got to do that personal work alongside of any of the work that we're doing externally with other people. Because otherwise, I think we'll get stuck and we'll continue to stay stuck in that pattern of oppression. And as soon as we maybe have access to a little more, or as soon as we we get past that implicit and we move to that explicit buy-in to the system, then we move into that oppressive structure of oppressing other people. And that's not where I want to be. I won't speak for y'all, but that's not where I want to be. And I hope that we're able to continue to do that work, whether it be an accountability chavruta, and they do this all over the country, where people are, they do their best to study these things together, and then they work out some of those struggles with themselves. So I know, Wendy, you were saying I want to know this other person. I don't want to necessarily hey, I think we have something in common, but you actually choose somebody who you would be an accountability partner with. And maybe that's an African American person, maybe it's not. But whoever it is, it's somebody who can actually, let's hold this accountability of trying our best to not buy into racial capitalism. Find that person you can do that work with, that you can ask those hard questions, you can process those hard things. So when those struggles come, you've got somebody with you. You're not alone. Did we reach the end of this? I want to keep going.
Yeah, I know. I mean, planned for 4:30 to 5:30, and I know that the teachers who are with us, as well as everyone else, I'm sure would like to continue the conversation. So if you want to, you can stay, but I would personally like to just thank you so much for coming. I think it was a fascinating, just little start to a conversation that I hope that I know we'll all be continuing in different ways. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you everyone for participating in this wonderful conversation. We'll see you soon.